Everyone mocked Officer Ethan Cole when he inherited a crumbling windmill in the middle of nowhere, calling it worthless, a joke, a dead end. But his loyal K9, Ranger, saw something no one else could. Sniffing, scratching, and digging at a single stone slab as if a hidden truth were calling him from beneath the earth. And when that stone finally moved, Ethan realized the real legacy wasn't the ruin above ground, but a secret buried deep below, one powerful enough to destroy the most untouchable men in Texas. The late summer sun hung heavy over the flat, dusty plains of West Texas, turning the air into a shimmering haze of gold and copper as a battered pickup truck rolled down a forgotten dirt road. Detective Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel with the same deliberate control he once used to hold an assault rifle. At 35, he had the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much too soon. Sharply cut jawline, a faint scar running from his left temple to the corner of his cheek, and a pair of cool, steel-blue eyes that always seemed to be watching for threats no one else could see. Years in the SWAT unit had carved patience and vigilance into his bones, but they had also left deep scars, both visible and not. Ethan had walked away from hostage crises, gunfights, and standoffs, yet the hardest battles were the ones that replayed behind closed eyelids at night. These days, he investigated homicides in Austin, chasing killers with methodical precision. But the ghosts of past missions still clung to him like dust to boots. And now, out of nowhere, an envelope from a lawyer had dropped into his mailbox, informing him that he had inherited a property from Parker Doyle, an eccentric engineer he hadn't spoken to in years. The pickup rattled over a rut as Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Parker. Parker had been an odd man, brilliant but detached. A man who saw the world not in colors or shapes, but in gears, torque, and equations. They had met a decade earlier when Parker volunteered as a technical consultant for a SWAT operation involving improvised explosives. Ethan had saved his life that night when a bomb rigged under a stairwell detonated prematurely. After that, they'd shared beers a handful of times, talking about duty, invention, and the strange weight of surviving when others hadn't. Parker had vanished from Ethan's life just as abruptly as he had entered it, until now. According to the will, Parker's only worldly asset was a parcel of land somewhere west of nowhere, topped by a crumbling, obsolete windmill. When Ethan finally turned off the main road, he was greeted by a lonely stretch of barren land, and a structure that looked like it had been abandoned since the Civil War. The windmill's massive wooden blades were splintered and motionless, frozen against the cobalt sky. The base, once a proud ring of limestone, was cracked and eroded by decades of relentless weather. Even the tower itself leaned slightly, its bleached planks creaking in the hot wind. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out, the oppressive silence of the plains pressing in around him. He had expected something modest, maybe even quaint. Instead, this was a graveyard monument to time's indifference. He almost laughed. Parker's legacy was nothing more than a pile of junk wood and stone. A sharp bark pulled him from his thoughts. Ranger, his K9 partner, leapt gracefully from the passenger seat and landed in the dust with a practiced ease. 7 years old and still in his prime, the German Shepherd was a muscular, dark sable powerhouse with intelligent amber eyes that missed nothing. He had served beside Ethan in countless operations, from narcotics raids to kidnapping rescues. Like Ethan, Ranger bore his own scars, a bullet graze on his shoulder, a chipped fang, but beneath that battle-hardened exterior was a fiercely loyal heart. The two of them shared a bond that went beyond handler and dog. They were soldiers without a war, partners who understood each other without words. Ethan gave a low whistle, and Ranger trotted toward the windmill, nose twitching as he catalogued every scent carried by the dry wind. Ethan walked the perimeter of the structure, boots crunching over parched earth. The silence out here was different from the silence in the city. Heavier, more absolute. He thought about how everyone at the precinct had laughed when they heard about his inheritance. A windmill out here? They'd joked that he should turn it into a bird-watching tower or sell it for scrap. Ethan had brushed off the teasing, but now, standing in front of the ruin, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. Why had Parker left this to him? Was it some final joke from a man who had never quite fit into the world? Or was there something more to this forgotten place? He didn't have long to ponder. Ranger's behavior suddenly shifted. The dog, usually composed and deliberate, had become animated, even frantic. He sniffed aggressively around the northern base of the windmill, circling a section of the foundation with growing urgency. Then, without warning, he began to dig. Powerful paws sending up clouds of dry soil, his claws scraping against stone. A low, insistent whine rose from his throat, the kind of sound he made when he had located contraband or a buried weapon. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, kneeling beside him. He pressed his palm to the ground, but felt nothing unusual, just dust, dry roots, and rock. Yet Ranger was relentless, driven by an instinct Ethan had learned to trust more than most people's words. The wind gusted suddenly, rattling the windmill's rotting blades, and for a moment Ethan's skepticism faltered. Maybe this wasn't about the windmill at all. Maybe Parker, with his labyrinthine mind and love of puzzles, had hidden something here, something meant for Ethan to find. He crouched beside Ranger, brushing aside loose dirt to reveal a wide, flat slab of stone embedded in the ground. It looked ordinary enough, but the dog's nose stayed glued to its edge, tail rigid, body trembling with intensity. Ethan felt a spark, faint but undeniable, flicker in his chest. It wasn't much, but after years spent chasing human darkness, it was enough to awaken an old part of himself, the part that believed in purpose. And as the sun dipped lower over the Texas plains, painting the windmill in shades of blood-red gold, Detective Ethan Cole realized this forgotten ruin might be more than a worthless relic. It might be the beginning of something Parker had wanted him, and only him, to discover. The next morning, the Texas sun rose blood orange over the horizon, burning away the night's chill and painting the barren land around the windmill in harsh golden light. Detective Ethan Cole hadn't slept much. He'd spent most of the night pacing the creaking floorboards of his small rental house, his mind spinning with possibilities. That slab of stone Ranger had found, and the strange urgency in the dog's behavior, refused to leave his thoughts. Parker Doyle had never done anything without reason. If there was something buried beneath that windmill, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. And that meant it was worth finding. By mid-morning, Ethan was back at the windmill with a crowbar, a flashlight, and Ranger padding silently beside him. As he studied the weathered stone more closely, he noticed something he'd missed before. Faint, almost invisible lines etched into its surface. They weren't natural fractures. They were intentional markings, carved with precision. His heart beat a little faster. Parker had always loved puzzles, and this looked like the beginning of one. But Ethan wasn't an engineer, and his knowledge of 19th century structures was limited to whatever he'd seen in old crime scenes. He needed someone who could read these patterns the way Parker once could. That was when he remembered Lena Petrova. She was an architectural historian he'd met briefly 2 years earlier during a joint investigation with the city's Historical Preservation Office. Lena had been in her late 20s then, tall and slim, with long waves of chestnut hair often tied back with a pencil, skin the warm olive shade of her Eastern European roots, and sharp hazel eyes that seemed to dissect every detail of the buildings she studied. She had a stubborn streak that bordered on reckless when it came to protecting historical sites, a trait born from watching her childhood neighborhood in Chicago be bulldozed for luxury condos. If anyone could help him understand Parker's riddle, it was her. Ethan called her. He wasn't sure she'd remember him, but after he mentioned Parker Doyle's name and a unique 19th-century windmill with unusual structural elements, Lena was in her car within hours. She arrived in a dusty green Jeep, stepping out with a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder and a camera around her neck. "You weren't kidding," she said, as she walked toward the windmill, her eyes scanning its warped structure with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "This design is unusual, late 1800s, but there are modifications that don't belong to that period." Ethan explained what had happened: the inheritance, Parker's connection, Ranger's behavior. Lena listened intently, her brow furrowing deeper with every detail. "Parker Doyle," she murmured. "I've read about some of his work. He was brilliant, ahead of his time. If he altered this structure, it wasn't cosmetic. He was hiding something." She knelt by the slab, brushing away dust with delicate, practiced fingers. As she traced the faint carvings, her expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. "This isn't random," she said softly. "It's a gear and compass motif, a signature Parker used in some of his private projects. It's like a maker's mark, but more complicated." She pulled a small notebook from her satchel and began sketching, aligning the lines with the slab's edges. "See this?" she pointed. "It's a 3-part mechanism: pressure, rotation, then release. A mechanical lock built into the foundation." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're saying this windmill has a door in the ground?" Lena gave a small, excited smile. "Exactly." The two of them worked carefully, following the sequence Lena had deduced. First, Ethan pressed on the center of the slab with steady pressure, hearing a soft, internal click. Then, he gripped the edge and turned it clockwise, muscles straining against decades of resistance. Finally, he pressed down on 2 opposite corners simultaneously. A deep, resonant thunk echoed beneath their feet. Dust billowed as the slab shifted slightly, and then, with a slow, heavy groan, it began to pivot inward, revealing a dark, narrow staircase spiraling into the earth. Ethan and Lena exchanged a glance. "Well," he said, his pulse quickening, "we found the basement." The air that rose from below was cool and stale, carrying the scent of stone and something faintly metallic. Ethan flicked on his flashlight and started down, Ranger close behind. Each step was steep and uneven, carved from rough limestone and worn smooth by time. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to disappear. The sound of the wind, the heat of the sun, even the oppressive emptiness of the Texas plains. All that remained was darkness and the soft rhythm of Ranger's paws on the stone. But halfway down, Ethan's breath caught. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thicker, heavier. The beam of his flashlight wavered as a memory surged forward. A raid in Juarez, a collapsing stairwell, screams muffled by choking dust. His chest tightened, his pulse racing. Not here, not now. He braced a hand against the wall, his knuckles white, but the ghosts were relentless. Sweat beaded on his brow as the darkness morphed into the claustrophobic ruins of a cartel bunker. "Ethan?" Lena's voice echoed faintly from above. "You okay?" He couldn't answer. His throat felt like it was closing. Then he felt a warm, steady pressure against his leg. Ranger had pressed himself against him, his amber eyes locked on Ethan's face. The dog let out a low, grounding whine, the same sound he'd made years ago when Ethan froze during a shootout. Slowly, The present began to reassert itself. Stone, flashlight, cool air, Ranger. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't under fire. He was here, now. Ethan drew a shaky breath and nodded. "I'm fine," he managed. "Just needed a second." They continued downward until the staircase ended in a small landing and a heavy iron door, its surface etched with more of Parker's intricate gear and compass designs. Lena ran her fingers across the carvings, her brow furrowing. "This isn't just a door," she said softly. "It's a message. Parker wanted whoever found this to think before they opened it." Ethan aimed his flashlight at the handle, a simple brass wheel, tarnished but functional. He hesitated. "What do you think's behind it?" Lena smiled faintly. "With Parker? Anything." He turned the wheel. Metal ground against metal, and the door swung open with a low hiss, releasing a rush of cold, stale air. The beam of the flashlight pierced the darkness beyond, illuminating what lay inside. Not a cellar or storage space, but a corridor that seemed to stretch deeper beneath the earth. Pipes lined the ceiling. Strange, dust-covered machinery hummed faintly along the walls. It was nothing like what Ethan expected beneath an old windmill. "This isn't a basement," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lena. "It's something else." As they stepped through the doorway, Ranger leading the way with his ears pricked and nose twitching, Ethan felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration twist in his chest. Whatever Parker had hidden down here, it wasn't meant for casual discovery. It was a secret, one built for someone Parker trusted. And as the darkness swallowed them, Ethan knew that he was only beginning to understand the scale of what he'd inherited. The air grew colder and drier as Detective Ethan Cole, Lena Petrova, and Ranger stepped deeper into the underground corridor. The heavy iron door clanged shut behind them, with a sound that echoed like a gavel in an empty courtroom. The light from Ethan's flashlight swept over rusted pipes and aging conduits snaking along the stone walls, converging toward a thicker steel bulkhead at the far end. As they approached, the hum beneath their boots intensified, a low, steady vibration that didn't belong in a century-old windmill. Ethan pressed his ear to the steel and heard it clearly, the rhythmic pulse of machinery, alive and relentless. When he spun the locking wheel and pushed the door open, the sight beyond stole his breath. A cavernous chamber stretched out before them, twice the size of a basketball court, sealed in reinforced concrete and lined with row upon row of sleek, black server racks. Blue and green indicator lights blinked like a field of stars, and the air thrummed with the sound of hundreds of processors working in concert. On one wall, a massive cylindrical generator connected to a lattice of power inverters hummed steadily, a faint turbine whine rising above the mechanical chorus. A nearby monitor displayed a single line of text: Doyle Turbine System. Status: optimal. Output: 98%. Parker hadn't just modified the windmill. He had turned it into a self-sustaining energy source that powered this hidden fortress of data. Lena moved forward in stunned silence, her boots clicking on the polished floor. "This isn't just an archive," she whispered. "It's a vault. A living system." Ethan approached a waist-high command console at the center of the room. On it lay a leather-bound notebook embossed with the same gear and compass symbol they had seen above. He opened it with care, and Parker Doyle's neat, angular handwriting stared back at him. "If you are reading this," the note began, "then I have failed. But you, Ethan, have not. What lies within this room is the truth, a truth men like Marcus Albright and Gideon Blake would kill to keep buried. I tried to fight them. Now it's your turn." Ethan's chest tightened as he read Parker's words. This wasn't just a gift. It was a mission. The rest of the notebook read like a blueprint of corruption. There were diagrams of corporate structures that spiraled outward like spider webs, each thread leading to a shell company, an offshore account, or a real estate acquisition under a false name. Parker had meticulously documented how Albright, a billionaire developer with a public reputation for philanthropy, had bought up hundreds of properties through shadow corporations, laundered billions through Caribbean banks, and bribed local officials to secure zoning changes. At the center of it all was a single, elegant signature repeated again and again on fraudulent deeds and court orders. Judge Gideon Blake. Ethan's jaw clenched as he read. Blake's name. Blake had been a rising star in the Texas legal system for years, a tall, silver-haired judge known for his cool, patrician demeanor and his community-first rulings. In reality, Parker's notes showed he was the keystone in Albright's empire. It was Blake who dismissed lawsuits from displaced families, Blake who fast-tracked construction permits for Albright's projects, Blake who ensured that stolen land stayed stolen. Ethan had testified in Blake's courtroom before. He had even shaken the man's hand. The thought turned his stomach now. Lena flipped through another section of the notebook and stopped at a series of grainy surveillance photographs. They showed Albright, a burly man in his mid-50s with sun-leathered skin, a trimmed silver beard, and cold, shark-gray eyes, shaking hands with state legislators, slipping envelopes into their hands, and posing beside Blake at ribbon cuttings. There were even audio transcripts of private meetings, each more damning than the last. He built an empire on other people's suffering, Lena murmured, her voice trembling with anger. Ethan nodded grimly. And Parker died trying to stop it. A sharp bark from Ranger pulled their attention to a corner of the room. The dog was sniffing intently at a metal cabinet bolted to the wall, his tail rigid. Ethan opened it carefully, revealing a small, dust-covered safe. Inside was a portable hard drive, a stack of legal documents, and, most chillingly, a digital voice recorder. Ethan pressed play. Parker's voice filled the chamber, calm but defiant. It's over, Marcus. I have everything. The accounts, the shell companies, the fraudulent deeds. It all leads back to you. Another voice answered, one Ethan recognized instantly from recorded interrogations. Marcus Albright. You're a clever man, Parker, but you're also a fool. Do you think a few files will stop me? A third voice, smoother and colder, followed. What Mr. Albright means is that this evidence will never see the light of day. Blake. The recording captured the confrontation in chilling detail. Parker's final moments, his refusal to sell the land, the scuffle, the sharp gasp, and Blake's final order. Make it look like an accident. Machinery is unpredictable. The room fell silent except for the steady hum of the servers. Ethan stared at the recorder, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He had seen murder scenes before, too many, but hearing Parker's death, knowing the men responsible were still free, lit something cold and primal inside him. This was no longer just evidence. It was a war. Lena broke the silence first. We need to take this to the police. Ethan shook his head. We can't. Blake is the police. He controls half the justice system in this county. If we hand this over now, it disappears. And so do we. She swallowed hard, but didn't argue. They both knew he was right. Parker's files were explosive, but they were worthless if buried. They needed a plan, a way to get the evidence into federal hands without tipping off Albright's network. Ethan paced the room, thinking like the tactical operator he once was. We document everything. We back up every file, every recording. We make copies, hide them in multiple places. And then we go dark until we find a way out. As they worked, copying terabytes of data and photographing key documents, Ranger never left Ethan's side. The dog's presence was steady and grounding, a living reminder of why they were doing this. Not for revenge, but for justice. Hours passed, and the chamber's hum became a kind of heartbeat, steady and determined. But beneath the focus, a shadow of unease lingered in Ethan's mind. Parker had built this vault to hide the truth. But if he had been found, there was no guarantee they wouldn't be too. And if Albright knew about this place, he wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone connected to it. By the time they packed up, the sun had long since set above ground. The windmill cast a crooked silhouette against a rising moon as Ethan and Lena emerged from the hidden stairway. The night air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of what they had discovered. As they locked the slab back into place and returned to the truck, Ethan glanced once more at the structure looming in the darkness. It was no longer a ruin. It was the heart of a machine, one designed to expose a monster. And whether they were ready or not, they had just stepped onto its battlefield. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Ethan Cole and Lena Petrova were still working in the underground chamber, methodically duplicating files and uploading Parker's data to multiple encrypted drives, when Ranger's ears snapped upright. The dog's body stiffened, his amber eyes locked on the stairwell. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. Ethan froze. Ranger didn't growl without reason. A second later, he heard it too. The faint, rhythmic thud of boots descending the steps above them. Whoever was coming wasn't sneaking. They wanted to be heard. Ethan extinguished his flashlight and motioned Lena towards the far corner. He pulled his sidearm from the holster at his waist, the weapon cold and familiar in his hands. But before he could take a position, the heavy door at the top of the stairwell exploded inward, its hinges tearing from the frame. The metallic crash echoed through the chamber, followed by the harsh glare of tactical flashlights slicing through the dark. "Detective Cole," a deep, confident voice called out, dripping with mockery. "I was hoping we'd meet under better circumstances." Marcus Albright stepped through the doorway first, flanked by two armed men in dark tactical gear. Up close, he looked even more imposing than in Parker's photographs. 6'3" with a thick, powerful build, a trimmed salt and pepper beard, and eyes that gleamed with predatory arrogance. His expensive charcoal suit was out of place in the damp subterranean air, but it was clearly intentional, a show of control, of untouchable wealth. "I see you found Parker's little toy room," he said, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Shame he didn't live long enough to give you the grand tour." Behind him, Judge Gideon Blake followed, his expression colder than the steel walls around them. In person, Blake was a study in quiet menace, tall and gaunt, with neatly combed silver hair and piercing gray eyes that radiated disdain. Years in courtrooms had honed his voice into a weapon. Calm, deliberate, every word chosen to slice. "Detective Cole," he said evenly, "you're trespassing on private property, accessing data you have no legal right to possess. That's a very serious offense." Ethan lowered his weapon slightly, though not entirely. "And orchestrating a murder? Laundering billions through shell corporations? Those are crimes too." Blake didn't flinch. "Allegedly." The two men spread out, their enforcers moving in to surround Ethan and Lena. One of the bodyguards, a scarred, heavy-set man with a shaved head and a broken nose, seized Lena by the arm and shoved her against the wall. She hissed in pain, but didn't cry out. Another man grabbed Ethan's gun arm and wrenched the weapon away before slamming a fist into his ribs. The breath left his body in a sharp gasp. Albright stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me every copy of Parker's data, every file, every recording, every photograph. Then you're going to forget this place ever existed." "And if I don't?" Ethan asked, straightening slowly despite the pain blooming in his side. Albright's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then this place becomes your tomb." The thugs forced Ethan and Lena to the floor and zip-tied their wrists. Ranger lunged forward with a snarl, but one of the men swung a baton, catching him across the shoulder. The German shepherd yelped and stumbled back, dazed but still standing, his teeth bared. "Hurt that dog again," Ethan growled, "and Albright cut him off with a raised hand. "Relax, detective. I'm not a monster. I have no reason to harm the animal, unless you make me." They dragged Ethan and Lena into a storage room at the far end of the chamber, a narrow, windowless cell with a single ventilation shaft near the ceiling, and slammed the steel door behind them. A lock clicked into place. The hum of the servers was still audible through the walls, but so was the muffled sound of Albright's men tearing through the vault, searching for the original drives. Ethan sat back against the cold floor, his wrists burning against the restraints. "They're going to destroy everything," Lena whispered, her voice shaking. "All of Parker's evidence." "Not if we stop them," Ethan said. His mind was already racing, piecing together a plan from scraps of possibility. The ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for a human, might be big enough for a dog. And there was still one thing they had that Albright didn't: Ethan's phone, tucked in a hidden pocket inside Ranger's vest. He turned to the dog, who was licking the welt on his shoulder but otherwise alert. "Ranger," he said softly. "Come here." Working quickly, Ethan freed one of his hands by dislocating his thumb and slipping the zip tie over his wrist. The pain was white-hot, but he didn't have time to care. He pulled the phone from Ranger's vest, activated the emergency SOS beacon, and secured it back into the dog's harness. "Listen to me," he whispered, stroking Ranger's head. "Find help. Go." The dog stared at him for a moment, as if he understood the weight of what was being asked, and then bounded toward the ventilation shaft. He leapt, claws scraping against the wall, and wriggled his way inside, his tail disappearing into the darkness. Ethan exhaled slowly. If Ranger could make it to the surface, the phone's signal would bring law enforcement straight to the Windmill. If he couldn't, there would be no one left to find them. Minutes dragged into an hour. Lena slumped against the wall, her face pale but determined. "They're not just going to destroy the data," she said quietly. "They're going to kill us." Ethan nodded. "Not before I make sure they turn on each other, first." He reached into his boot and pulled out a small, battered flash drive, a duplicate of Parker's final recording he had created earlier that night. With a bit of improvisation, he wired it into the room's emergency PA system. Moments later, Parker's voice filled the underground chamber once more. "It's over, Marcus. I have everything. The accounts, the shell companies, the fraudulent deeds, and I know Judge Blake signed off on all of it." The reaction was immediate. Through the walls they heard shouting, Albright's voice, furious and accusing, Blake's cold and defensive. The alliance that had seemed so unshakable was fracturing under the weight of paranoia. "You said this was handled," Albright roared. "You promised nothing could trace back to me." "Watch your tone, Marcus," Blake hissed. "You're not the only one with things to lose." The argument escalated, echoing through the corridor, and Ethan felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. Chaos was their only advantage now, and he had just lit the match. The room suddenly shook as a loud hiss reverberated through the chamber. Ethan crawled toward a coolant pipe running along the floor and aimed a single well-placed kick at a weak joint. The metal burst, spraying freezing liquid into the air. The temperature plummeted, alarms wailed, and the server's hum faltered under the sudden stress. "Now they've got a bigger problem," he muttered. Somewhere above them, Ranger was running through the night, guided by instinct and training, carrying the one signal that might save them. And as the wind howled across the empty Texas plains, Ethan Cole pressed his back against the cold steel wall, knowing the real battle had only just begun. The sound of sirens was faint at first, a distant wail cutting through the heavy Texas night. But as minutes crawled forward, it grew louder, sharper, closer. Ethan Cole pressed his ear against the cold steel door of the chamber, his heart pounding with a cautious mix of hope and disbelief. "You hear that?" he whispered. Lena Petrovna nodded, her brown eyes wide. "Ranger did it." There was no doubt now. Somewhere above, his loyal German shepherd had reached the surface and led help back to them. Upstairs, chaos erupted. Heavy boots thundered against the windmill's old wooden floors, and muffled shouts echoed through the night air. The sudden commotion sent a surge of adrenaline through Ethan's veins. He stood up, his shoulders squared and his jaw set. The exhaustion of the past few hours burned away by renewed purpose. "This ends tonight," he said quietly. The steel door burst open a moment later. Floodlights sliced through the darkness, and a wave of uniformed deputies poured into the subterranean chamber, their rifles raised and commands booming through the confined space. At the front of the group was Sheriff Miguel Ramirez, a man in his late 50s with a thick gray mustache, sharp eyes, and the steady, deliberate movements of someone who had spent 3 decades chasing justice through the dirt and dust of West Texas. Ramirez was a lawman to the bone. Calm under pressure, known for his relentless pursuit of truth and his deep disdain for corruption. He carried himself with the weight of a man who had seen too much, but refused to surrender his faith in the law. "Hands where I can see them," Ramirez barked. His deputies fanned out, forming a perimeter around the chamber. Albright's bodyguards reacted instantly, reaching for their weapons, but the sheer number of lawmen, all heavily armed and trained, crushed any illusions of resistance. Within seconds, both men were face down on the concrete floor, cuffed and disarmed. Marcus Albright stood frozen near the server racks, his once imposing frame suddenly looking smaller under the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. Sweat streaked down his tanned face, his eyes darting between the approaching deputies and the stone staircase behind them, as if searching for an impossible escape. "This is a mistake," he stammered. "I'm a businessman, a respected citizen." "Save it," Ramirez interrupted coldly, his boots echoing across the chamber as he approached. "We've got enough evidence here to bury you 3 times over." Judge Gideon Blake was seated calmly on a bench, hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression eerily composed. The immaculate gray suit was still perfectly pressed, the silver hair still meticulously combed. But there was a deadness in his eyes now, the hollow stare of a man whose carefully constructed illusion of power had finally cracked. "Sheriff," he said smoothly, as if addressing a courtroom, "this is a gross misunderstanding. I intend to cooperate fully, but you should know that—" "You should know," Ramirez cut in, "that we have a recording of you ordering a murder." He held up a small digital recorder sealed in an evidence bag. Blake's composure faltered for the first time, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face before the mask slipped back into place. Ethan and Lena emerged from the cell as deputies secured the last of the suspects. Ranger bounded toward them from the stairwell, his sable and black fur dusted with dirt, his chest heaving from exertion. He leapt into Ethan's arms with a joyous bark, tail wagging wildly. Ethan knelt, wrapping his arms around the dog's sturdy frame. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You brought them here." Sheriff Ramirez approached them, his stern expression softening. "That's one hell of a K9 you've got there, detective," he said. "He led us straight to the site. Even tried to pull my patrol car off the road to make sure we didn't miss the turn." He extended a hand, and Ethan shook it firmly. "We couldn't have done this without him." As the night stretched into dawn, The Windmill became the epicenter of one of the largest crime scenes in Texas history. Forensic teams combed through the underground bunker, collecting Parker Doyle's meticulously compiled data. Terabytes of financial records, fake deeds, offshore accounts, and shell corporations that traced every dollar of Albright's criminal empire. The dates on the forged documents, cross-referenced with Ethan's evidence of Parker's whereabouts overseas, formed a timeline so damning it dismantled years of corruption in a single stroke. The recorded conversation sealed the case. It captured Albright's threats, Blake's cold-blooded commands, and the chilling moment Parker was murdered. Prosecutors would later call it the smoking gun, a piece of evidence so decisive that even the most expensive legal defense would crumble beneath its weight. By midday, Marcus Albright, Judge Gideon Blake, and their 2 bodyguards were loaded into separate armored vehicles and driven away under heavy guard. Albright shouted empty threats about lawyers and retaliation. Blake remained silent, staring blankly out the window of the transport van. For the first time in decades, both men were powerless. 2 weeks later, the scale of their crimes dominated national headlines. Texas real estate tycoon and state judge charged in massive corruption probe, read one. K9 helps crack billion-dollar crime syndicate, read another. Investigations rippled outward, ensnaring politicians, business partners, and complicit officials across multiple states. Their empire collapsed overnight, its assets frozen, its projects seized. Through it all, Ranger's story became the heart of the narrative. News crews flocked to film the German shepherd, who had braved the unknown, of whom, bring help. At a ceremony held by the Texas Law Enforcement Association, Ranger stood proudly beside Ethan in front of a cheering crowd. His fur was freshly brushed, his amber eyes gleaming with intelligence and loyalty, as a silver medal was placed around his neck. The plaque read, K9 Rescue Dog of the Year for unwavering courage and service in the line of duty. Lena was there too, smiling through tears as she watched the scene unfold. He deserves it, she whispered. You both do. Ethan chuckled softly, scratching Ranger behind the ears. He's the real hero here, he said. I just followed his lead. But beneath the applause and accolades, Ethan felt something deeper stirring, a profound, almost sacred sense of closure. Parker's work had not been in vain. The man who had died trying to expose a vast web of greed and corruption had been vindicated. His evidence had toppled giants. His death had meaning. That night, as the sun dipped low over the Texas plains, Ethan returned to the now quiet Windmill. The once crumbling structure stood as a monument to truth and justice, its silhouette outlined against a blood-red sky. Ranger lay at his feet, ears twitching in the evening breeze. It's over, partner, Ethan said softly. We did it. Ranger gave a small, contented bark and rested his head on Ethan's boot. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe that the ghosts of his past, the failures, the regrets, the burdens he had carried, were finally beginning to fade. And as the stars began to appear over the vast Texas horizon, he knew this was not just an ending, but the beginning of something new. A year had passed since that night beneath the earth, when truth shattered an empire and justice finally caught up to power. The Texas wind still swept across the plains as it always had, bending the tall prairie grass into soft, whispering waves. But now it carried a different kind of sound, a deep, rhythmic whoosh as the blades of the Parker Doyle historic windmill sliced gracefully through the evening air. The structure, once a forgotten ruin mocked as worthless, now stood tall and proud against the fading crimson sky. Its restored stone base gleamed with strength and permanence, the wooden tower treated and sealed to a rich, warm hue. It was no longer a monument to decay, but a living testament to resilience, truth, and the stubborn belief that some battles are worth fighting, no matter the odds. Detective Ethan Cole stood at the crest of the hill, the setting sun washing his face in amber light. Time had softened the harsh edges of his features. The deep lines of strain around his eyes had eased, and the haunted sharpness that once lingered there was slowly giving way to something gentler. Yet, there was still steel beneath the calm, a strength forged not in anger now, but in purpose. A year ago, this place had been the site of betrayal and blood. Now it was a sanctuary. The land was federal property protected as a historical landmark, and the Windmill, once Parker Doyle's secret, had become a beacon for school tours, veterans groups, and travelers passing through the quiet back roads of West Texas. A simple bronze plaque set into the stone path at its base bore the inscription, "In memory of Parker Doyle, whose courage and brilliance proved that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed." Beside Ethan, Ranger sat proudly, his thick sable coat touched with strands of gray now, his once boundless energy mellowed into the steady dignity of age. His amber eyes remained as bright and intelligent as ever, and though he moved a little slower, he still carried himself with the confidence of a dog who had faced danger and prevailed. He was a hero now, a name known far beyond the Texas state line. People stopped Ethan on the street to shake his hand and to crouch down and pet Ranger, thanking them both for what they had done. But fame meant little to Ethan. What mattered was that they had kept their promise, to Parker, to justice, and to each other. The case against Marcus Albright and Judge Gideon Blake had ended as expected. Convictions on nearly every count, sentences measured in decades rather than years. Their empire had been dismantled, their names forever synonymous with corruption. But even in victory, Ethan had felt something deeper stirring, a responsibility that went beyond a single investigation. Parker had believed in building something that lasted, and Ethan was determined to do the same. That belief had led him to create the Doyle Foundation, a nonprofit organization born from the E-Foyt, whistleblower rewards, and seized assets that had once fueled Albright's empire. Its mission was twofold: to provide mental health counseling and reintegration support for law enforcement officers struggling with trauma, and to train service dogs for police and veterans dealing with PTSD. The Foundation's headquarters, a modest but welcoming brick building in the heart of Austin, was run by a small but dedicated team. At the front desk, Melissa Hanley, a former therapist with warm hazel eyes and a calm, empathetic demeanor, greeted every visitor as if they were old friends. Melissa, in her mid-40s, had once run a crisis counseling program for first responders until budget cuts shut it down. A childhood tragedy, losing her father, a police officer, to suicide, had shaped her life's work and given her an unwavering passion for supporting those who served. "We're not here to fix anyone," she often said. "We're here to remind them they're not broken." The Canine Training Wing was led by Officer Daniel Reyes, a broad-shouldered, kind-eyed K-9 handler in his late 30s who had retired from the San Antonio Police Department after a back injury ended his field career. Reyes had a gentle way with dogs, a low, steady voice, and endless patience, and a quiet respect for the animals that mirrored Ethan's own. Under his care, dozens of German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labradors were trained to serve as companions and guardians, helping veterans and officers reclaim their independence and peace. "Every leash we hand over," Reyes told Ethan once, "is a second chance for two lives, the human and the dog." Ethan visited the Foundation often, not to oversee its work, but simply to be part of it. He spent afternoons talking with officers who came for counseling, or walking through the training yards with Ranger at his side, watching new teams bond in the way only handler and service dog can. It was quiet work, humble work, but to Ethan it felt more meaningful than anything he had done in a uniform. He had spent years chasing criminals, building cases, and putting people behind bars. Now he was building futures. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent over the plains, Lena Petrova arrived at the Windmill for the first time since the trial. Time had changed her too. The young historian, once driven by raw idealism, now carried herself with a seasoned confidence. Her curly chestnut hair, usually tied back hastily during their investigations, framed her face softly as the breeze played with loose strands. Her eyes, still warm and curious, now carried a depth born of hard-won experience. She had taken a position with the state's Historical Preservation Office, dedicating her career to protecting landmarks like this one. "It feels different now," she said, standing beside Ethan as they watched the blades turn. "Like it finally belongs to the people." "It always did," Ethan replied quietly. "Parker just needed someone to fight for it." They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them thinking about the man who had brought them together, the engineer with a restless mind and an unshakable belief in truth. As twilight deepened and the prairie sky shifted to hues of rose and violet, Ethan knelt beside Ranger and rested a hand on the dog's broad shoulder. "We did good, partner," he murmured. "Not just stopping them, but building something that'll last." Ranger's tail thumped softly against the grass in response. They had come to this place broken, a man haunted by the past and a dog forged in service, and together they had turned pain into purpose. The last light of day spilled across the horizon, and for a moment the spinning blade seemed to glow like a great bronze compass, pointing not to a destination, but to a calling. It was no longer just about Parker's legacy, or even justice served. It was about what came after, the duty to keep fighting for the vulnerable, to speak for the silenced, to build a world where truth could stand unshaken. And in that quiet moment, with the Texas wind in his hair, and Ranger leaning gently against his leg, Ethan Cole knew that their mission was far from over. It had only just begun. In the end, Ethan's journey wasn't just about justice. It was about grace. What began as a story of loss and corruption became a reminder that miracles still exist, often hidden in loyalty, courage, and the unwavering love of a faithful friend. Like the wind that turns the blades of the restored windmill, God's hand is always moving, guiding us through the darkest valleys toward light and redemption. May this story inspire you to believe that no truth is ever lost and no soul is beyond saving. If this touched your heart, share it with others, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to join us. May God bless and protect you and those you love.